record it. Okay. Deb Kalita, she's my marketing director. She always keeps me in check. Just FYI, don't we all need someone like that in our lives? All right. So here we go. We are going to talk about resiliency today. And really what it comes down to is 3 different areas. First set of questions will be around how do we define resilience? And this is a word that's being thrown around a lot right now, but really we're going to share a great perspective on that. And then what are the factors for resiliency will be our next set of questions. And then how do you go about developing resiliency? But first, I want Holly to answer a really great question that I'm sure is on each and every one of our minds right now. Why is it so darn exhausting to live in ambiguity?
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and to all of you. Great to meet you virtually. I'm Holly Greene. I'm the CEO of The Human Factor, and it's a consulting firm that focuses on helping teams, leaders, and organizations define and achieve success. So a lot of consulting work, keynotes, etc. My background, briefly, just to give some context, is behavioral sciences, and my postgraduate work is in neurophysiology. So how does the brain work at work? And that's kind of the perspective that I can bring on resilience today. So our brain, one of the key things to think about when we think about the adult human brain is that we love what we already know. We get great comfort in the things that we are most familiar with. Our brain tends to travel the very same pathways over and over, which is why we can see people get in the same bad relationships, make the same mistakes at work over and over, even with good coaching, etc. So that's really important to remember. And in a time of not only constant, but really unexpected change, our brain processes this constant and unexpected change as ambiguity. And it feels like everything suddenly is unknown, everything is changing, everything in our world has gone crazy. And our brain tends to do that. Outside of that normal pathway we travel, when we begin to get outside of that, it feels like everything is changing, not just 1 or 2 things. That's why this ambiguity is exhausting, because it keeps us in the cycle of processing constant change. Which we'll talk more about those cycles and the factors of resiliency in a minute. But that's really at the core of why it is so exhausting. Our brain just doesn't like it. It just doesn't like it. It's uncomfortable. And so we spin a lot.
So it's somewhat okay right now, Holly, that all of us feel a little bit more tired than usual, right? That's okay for all of us to feel that.
Listen, I know this stuff. I live and breathe this stuff, and I'm sleeping a good extra hour a day.
Okay. All right, good. I'm glad I'm not the only one. So,
you're normal.
Catherine, what can we do right now to stay resilient in these very challenging times?
Thank you so much for that question and for the opportunity to talk today. So I'm Catherine Sanderson. I'm a professor of psychology at Commerce College, and I talk a lot about happiness and resilience and health, and I've written a book that examines this in more detail. So for people who want to learn more, I have a website, which is sandersonspeaking.com, that gives lots of information, in more detail about this. But to answer your question right now, and I've been writing and thinking and talking a lot about this over the last few weeks, and I think there's key things for us to remember that even in the state of this tremendous ambiguity, as Holly so eloquently just described, there are things that we can do. So one, we all really need to focus on wellness. And that includes eating healthy foods, even when we might be sort of tempted to sit at home and snack. It includes doing some kind of exercise. I know a lot of us are addicted to, going to a Pilates class or the gym, or even being able to, run or walk outside. Doing whatever we can is really important in terms of focusing on our physical well-being. It's also, and again, Holly alluded to this in her description, to practice positive thinking, to help develop the neural connections in the brain that let us do that. That is not, in all honesty, one of my strengths. So this is really putting me to task in terms of that. But it's really important to take this moment and say, I've always wanted to learn how to bake bread, or gosh, here's my bucket list of books I've been meaning to read, and now I have some time because I'm no longer commuting or whatever,
Right.
And really focus on what's good. And then I think the third thing, and this is actually the reason why I was so honored to be asked to participate today, is it's really important to build connections. That most of us are sitting alone in our basement, our bedroom, our home office, whatever, and it can be really isolating. And so having opportunities to make connections with other people, whether that's our colleagues, our family members, our friends from high school or college, whatever, forming connections is extraordinarily important in terms of staying resilient right now.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I was actually just talking about staying positive with some of the panelists as they were joining, and being so appreciative of the technology that we have today. Could you imagine if this all happened even just 10 years ago? what type of strains would be in our lives today. So being very grateful for what we do have goes a long way. Catherine, thank you so much for that perspective. I was writing down and I put a big circle around exercise because that has gone off the cliff. So, okay. All right, good. Elena, are you guys all laughing because it's happening to you, or is that just me? Okay, so Elena, let's switch a little bit to work, our work environment. How do you define and approach resiliency in your work?
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. My name is Elena Noel, and I'm the founder and principal of Inspiring Accountability in the Workplace, and I'm also a certified neuro-linguistic programming practitioner. And I have two books. One is Happiness is Overrated, Live the Inspired Life Instead, and Inspiring Accountability in the Workplace, Unlocking the Brain Secrets to Employee Engagement, Accountability, and Results. So for me, my work is all about happiness, wellness, actually less wellness in terms of what it means today, but looking at how our brain responds to our well-being in the workplace and then attaching that to how we can inspire accountability. So answering your question, I define resiliency in my work as the pathway from going from anxious to empowered. And there's a great quote from Dr. Sharon Melnick, and it's, stress occurs when the demands of a situation exceed your perceived ability to control them. Even the mere perception of control reduces the stimulation of a stress response. So much like the other panelists I work with, understanding the brain, the nervous system, and how we're naturally wired to respond. And in that journey from going to a very anxious state, which is, I would say, fair to say, inevitable in times like this, coming in and out of that, the more quickly and resourcefully we can move from anxiousness to empowerment begins to help us get a little more perception of control. And so there are 5 steps toward resiliency that I see from anxiousness to empowerment. And that is, starting in our place, okay, we're noticing that we're anxious. And this can look like a lot of different things. Some people respond more with panic, with internal sadness, with outward emotion, with irritation. And so we all have a different flavor of what that looks like. And then moving from that into acknowledging, what are we resisting? So when we resist, if you think about, you put your hands together and you resist, what happens? You get stuck. You're on pause. You're literally not able to move. So when we can identify what aspects we're resisting, then we can, if I stop resisting, we can allow something to move. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that often looks like the stages of grief. And then when we release that resistance, we can move toward acceptance and accepting. And that's not saying I'm okay with what's happening. It's saying, okay, this is happening. Once we get there, we can actually then become resourceful. And I'll talk in the next question about what it means for the brain itself to be resourceful, the resourceful place in the brain. But that's where we might be able to finally upgrade some of our beliefs, which will affect our experience. And then we can also choose realistic optimism. We were just talking about the positive mindset. And then from there, we can become empowered. And that shifts that whole journey of feeling like we have no control to a place where we're actually calm the nervous system and come back to a place of empowerment.
I'm almost wishing we had the whole morning to talk about this. I'm getting that feeling. Okay, thank you for that. And this is happening, so that is a great perspective to have, and I cannot wait to hear the further conversation that we have about that topic. So Tamara, let's go a little bit more practical, right? So you're a practitioner sitting in a seat of a woman in procurement, managing what's going on in your world today. How has Corteva and your leadership team, what have you been doing right now to help with your personal resiliency? So what has Corteva and their leadership team been doing to help you personally, but as well as your suppliers? Because all of your suppliers are going through this at this moment in time.
They are. So again, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Tamara Pulaski. I am the Global Procurement Director for Programs, Services, and Technologies here at Corteva. And I've been doing this for many, many years, and actually met Amanda when she was on a panel as a CPO back in ISM. And as a past president of ISM as well, New Jersey, it's one of those things where you take a look at what is it that we really need to be concerned about. And I work for an excellent company. I've been here now about 6 months, and really looking at what, when you come in as a new employee to begin with, and you have a staff and you have all this going on, and then to have this situation and event happen on top of it, it really has you not only self-reflect, but also look to see what experiences that you've dealt with over the years that you could bring with you. And supply chain is very used to having unprecedented events to happen, but not like this, right? Not globally to the effects that we're having today. We've had situations with, weather and wars and terroristic attacks and all of that within our supply chain. This pandemic, which everybody had assumed would just be in one area, has now become global. Yeah. And so what Corteva is a global company, and as Michelle stated, you know, we provide food for the world, right? And so we have to continue to do business. And so what does that mean, right? And so we become this essential piece to really help with some of the wellness and some of the other things that the other panelists have talked about today. And so again, there's things you can control and there's things you can't control. Mm-hmm. So let's focus on those things we can control. So what is Corteva doing for me as an employee? There's a constant communication that is coming out, letting me know what is happening with our company. We have global business centers, what's happening in each of those sites where I work today, what's happening there. Also, they have instituted an I'm okay check-in, which really makes myself, as well as my staff and some of my colleagues that I work with, helps us understand what we're all feeling, right? And so one of the things that I think is important for all of us to understand is to ask those questions. How are you doing? Are you okay? And so we do this on a daily basis. Also, Corteva has what's called a core for life. And when we start a meeting, we start off by really talking about either a health kind of advice, health advice, or really looking at safety. What can you do that's for safety, right? And so when you start to institute some of those things into your meetings today, even in Zoom, right, it's important because you're now connecting. Mm-hmm. And it's important. I know we talked about networking, right? Holly said, you know, stay connected. And so that's really important to continue to do that throughout that. Now we're doing the same thing with our supply chain. So we've now set up bi-weekly meetings where we actually, for our core strategic suppliers, we now do check-ins with them. And one of the areas that, as Amanda mentioned, that's getting hit really hard for my category areas is technology, right? Because in the technology space, we now have more network requirements that we have. Everybody's using Zoom. Now everybody's working remotely. What happens if servers go down, yeah, right? So there's a lot of view and a lot of look at technology. But fortunately for us, technology is actually used to having unprecedented events happen, right? Because that's how we get new releases, that's how we get new technology out there, because we need to react to what the market is requiring. Yeah. And so we're seeing that in our suppliers even today. And so the one thing that I would suggest to all of you who are in procurement is to check with your suppliers, whether it's your staff augmentation supplier or whether it is your technology supplier. Make sure that they're okay, even from as a person.
Yeah, no, I love that. And talking about networking, we're getting chat messages going on within the Zoom meeting. So Dr. Sean said, exquisite advice, Tamara. The check-in is imperative. So thank you for interacting with us. And we'll
thank you, yes,
to mention comments that are coming in. So Megan, question for you, and I love this question, by the way. Because of an organization's relationship with its critical vendors are essential to the organization's ability to manage disruption and affect positive turnaround, what role does resilience play in ensuring those critical supplier relationships are nourished?
Critical vendors. That's a phrase very familiar to me, Amanda. Thanks for the opportunity to share in today's conversation, by the way, folks. I'm Megan Cleghorn, and I am the president of Cleghorn Performance Elevation. We are a leadership development and executive coaching consultancy. We serve for-profit, not-for-profit, and governmental entities with a particular emphasis actually on navigating bold change. Prior to that, I served as CEO of Request for Relief, which is a stress management and resilience bolstering consultancy. But the first chapter of my career, I spent 15 years as a corporate restructuring attorney. That's a multi-syllabic phrase that for all intents and purposes means that we represented debtors and debtors in possession during the pendency of their Chapter 11 cases. Typically, it was a distressed turnaround through the oversight of the bankruptcy courts. And so preservation of relationships with key vendors and vendors who are critical to the operations and the successful progress of an organization was always in the forefront of a leader's mind and the organization's mind during times of heightened stress and distress, for sure. And last but not least, today I find myself in a particularly unique position because I also have the privilege of teaching the MBAs and in the MBA program for executives at Wharton Business School. And while I normally teach advanced persuasion, executive communication, and crisis communication under normal times, teaching crisis communication this semester at UPenn online is itself a unique experience. And so it is through that lens that I'm going to answer your question. And so today, organizations' supply chains, as everyone here appreciates, are more integrated, they're more interdependent than they've ever been before. Thus, disruption in one entity has a spillover effect all throughout the network of entities. And so one really important component of supply chain resiliency is the ability of an organization to maintain clear lines of communication, as Tamara has already referenced, and to optimize that collaboration with its suppliers, most importantly, the critical ones. So relationship management is essential, frankly, to supply chain resiliency. So during times of significant disruption, during times of exponentially higher stress, how many of us have the natural inclination to show up as the best version of ourselves? Or is there a greater probability of us being vulnerable to succumbing, right, to some of our stress responses, as we've already been talking about? Right now, we are all facing relationship nourishing opportunities and relationship management challenges, not only in the workplace, but of course, with respect to our private lives. Some of us, many of us are utterly thrilled to have a little bit more time at the house, to have a bit more time with loved ones and people that we cherish. That does not come, though, without its challenges and without its opportunities. And no matter the blessing of that, it also calls upon us to problem solve together. It calls upon us, right, to make collective decisions that impact how we, as people, and frankly, as leaders, operationalize our lives, how we finance our lives during this time of significant disruption, and how we manage the key people in our lives and on our teams. So if relationship management is key to managing our supply chains and our individual lives, the question really becomes, how do we ultimately then show up in these relationships as the best version of ourselves? As proactive communicators, right? As transparent collaborators, as clear-minded. How do we show up as calm and composed, notwithstanding the magnitude of the stress that we ourselves are experiencing? How do we show up as responsible, well-diligenced decision makers in these magnificently unprecedented times with a mindset, folks, of openness, with a mindset of receptivity? And so I guess the starting point for answering that question, understanding ourselves better, and what our stress responses are and what our stress triggers are. What triggers my fear? What triggers my anxiety? What triggers my self-doubt, my fight or flight response? And once you deepen, frankly, into that level of self-awareness, you can then create a self-management action plan. What we're really talking about here is bolstering one's resilience by sharpening one's emotional intelligence, because that lies at the core of being able to manage ourselves, understand why we think what we think, feel what we feel, and thus behave the way we behave. Once we understand that better, we can then outwardly regulate and outwardly manage our relationships more effectively. Now, I guess in closing, it's important that I do acknowledge that looking inward requires a lot of courage. Looking inward is not always a party. Looking inward may actually invite you to face some things that are just unpleasant to face. Right? And so I'll stipulate that that can be undigestible at times. But the long and the short of it is that the better that we understand why we think what we think and feel what we feel, and thus behave the way we behave, the more we can make an informed decision about how we interact effectively with others, and we can use that as a tool to predict other people's responses. And so I suppose, last but not least, I will leave everybody with the following invitation. Notwithstanding our best efforts, if we actually are working hard at securing those workplace relationships, those critical vendor relationships, those critical personal relationships, but we actually don't enjoy the flourishing in them that we'd like, we can sever those relationships. However, one can never sever her relationship with herself. You simply can't break up with you. One can get a divorce. One can terminate a relationship with a supplier. One can't break up with herself. And so I suggest to all of you that you are you're probably best positioned to be motivated to actually take a look inward and use that as the best predictive tool to face people outwardly and to navigate and nourish those relationships that are most critical to your performance.
Megan, wow. That is, so what I feel from that, the word that kept on coming up in my head was empathy. Empathy for yourself.
Yeah.
Others. I think we have to give, looking inwards and being that courageous to do that. You also have to have empathy for yourself, right? At the same time.
Oh, Amanda, 100%. You know what's fantastically interesting to me is that leaders of organizations understand that they have an obligation to act in the best interest of their key stakeholders, right? And if you're thinking about, for example, public companies, you have fiduciary duties, for heaven's sakes, to exercise your best business judgment and to act in the best interest of the entities who ultimately own you. And so why would the analysis be any different when you actually think about the stakeholders in you? You are the majority shareholder, if not the exclusive shareholder in you. You have, I would submit to all of you, a fiduciary duty to act in your own best interest. And acting in your own best interest begins with starting with self-compassion and with empathy. So 100% agree with that, Amanda.
Oh, I love the comments coming in too. Sarah just mentioned empathy. I stepped on the scale today. I do not recommend.
Where do we find the balance between empathy and denial? That's a tightrope.
Okay, Catherine, going back to you, let's talk about factors for resiliency a little bit. What factors predict your ability to be resilient? And I hope,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So there's good news and there's bad news. And so I would say that the bad news for some of us is that part of it seems our genes, that they're actually people who are hardwired and that thing happen and they just kind of roll with punches and it's pretty easy for them. So if you're one of those people, this is your time to shine. Congratulations. But then I think in what is also really important for all of us to remember is that research in psychology actually shows that people who've experienced some adverse events, and these are things like a divorce, a serious illness or injury, getting fired, serious things, that people who've experienced between 2 and 6 of these adverse events actually are happier and more resilient than people who experience none or only one of these events. And what that research tells us is that some diversity. So I think of resilience like a muscle. There may be people who are genetically faster, better at being resilient, but we can all learn to grow and develop that strength with practice. And in all honesty, this is a really adverse event that we're through, that people are feeling financial pressure. People are worried about their own health or their health of their loved ones. Worried about, what is their business going to survive? When are their kids ever going to go back to school and be outside of their home? Those of us who did not sign on to also be homeschool parents. And so it's a really adverse event. And what I think is that this is actually going to give us the opportunity to develop our ability to be more resilient as long as we can do so with a positive mindset, as other panelists have approached.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I love that. So we're actually exercising, even though we're not. Yeah, some of us. Okay.
Yeah, so don't get on the scale, but think about your own scale for resiliency. It's a different scale. It's not numeric.
So Elena, I have a question. You talked about how the brain, and several of you have mentioned how our brain reacts to situations like this. How does our brain affect resiliency?
So I use this example when I'm thinking about workplace situations. So even though we're all remote now, I'm sure it's not that far of a stretch to think back to a time when you may have been, let's say, talking with a coworker, and let's say you're brainstorming a project and it's going really well, you're sharing ideas, you're both getting excited, and just have that really nice creative flow going. And then all of a sudden you get a call from your boss and your boss says, I need you to come see me right now. So what we would see on a brain scan is when you were engaged in that conversation that was really creative and feeling positive, so to speak, is that the front part of your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, this is the more human brain, more evolved here, responsible for executive thinking, rational thinking, etc., would be all lit up. So you're having this great conversation, you're feeling good, and then the boss call comes in, which I think fair enough would trigger most of us, right? Clearly they're upset, we don't know what's going on. If you were looking at the brain scan, before that happened, it would be like flying over LA at night, all lit up with activity up here. The call comes in and this part goes virtually dark and all the activity moves to the back part here, which is kind of the critter brain, the creature brain, the reptile brain, the oldest part of the brain that does the fight, flee, or freeze response. And you can literally see how the activity in the brain shifts once we get triggered, once that stress comes in. So what we want to know is as we move from being anxious to empowered, is it's also the journey from when this anxious part of the brain gets triggered, our journey to letting that subside as quickly as we can, as resiliently as we can, letting that subside so that the activity and that lit up activity can come back to this part of the brain where we're rational and resourceful. So of course, once we get triggered, it hijacks our system essentially. It's the most powerful, the oldest part of the brain. It's really, really well patterned. So our ability to calm our nervous system And a lot of that can be done physically as well with our physiology, breathing, meditation. In the last question, I'll talk more about what questions we can ask ourselves to help us move that and be more resilient. And the other factor I think that's important about how our brains play a role in resiliency is, I'll ask you this, and this is for you to ponder since I know we don't have all unmuted participants right now. So what is the difference between feeling excited and feeling nervous?
It's how you perceive it.
It's what you're expecting.
Right.
Right. So when you're nervous, you're either in that place, as Holly said, of ambiguity or of uncertainty. If you're uncertain about something and your brain's coding it as essentially negative, or if you're full on just predicting a negative outcome, then you're going to have that sense of nervousness. But physiologically, it's very similar, right? We can start to sweat, our breathing and our heart rate can increase. Physically, there's not a lot of difference between that, but it's the brain and the meaning that it's making, the meaning your brain is making, that is going to control if you're feeling stressed or nervous or excited.
Yeah.
So just paying attention to that, one of our goals as we go from being anxious to empowered is that when you change the meaning, you change the experience of your experience.
Yeah. One of my speaking coaches actually told me once, she said, do you get nervous before speaking events? And I said, well, yeah, I mean, I think everyone gets a little bit nervous. And she's like, but no, really, what if you think about it as you're just excited to go in front of people? And I was like, well, that's a game changer.
Yeah, because we learned the physical cues and we associate that because it is kind of stress on the nervous system, but it doesn't have to be nervous.
Right.
It's just how our brains are coding it and how you want to code it, not want to, but kind of, yeah, how you're choosing to code it, the meaning you're making.
Correct.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah. Interesting. So Holly, so I think this builds on really well to what Elena was just talking about. What builds resiliency in ourselves and others, and what are your definition of factors of resiliency?
Well, there's a pretty good set of research around the core factors, what makes an individual and even an organization resilient. So those factors are positive, organized, focused, proactive, and flexible. And there are clear definitions around each of those. I'm happy to send anybody more information around those definitions and tips, etc., that you can use to increase your abilities in all of those areas. Kind of think about yourself as a sponge, right? And all the change is like water pouring onto this sponge. And at some point, the sponge is full, okay? And unless you are selective about what you squeeze out, if you will, as more continues to get poured on, it's usually the wrong things. So it's really crucial. I think everybody has touched on this and talking about, we do have choices. Change is external. Transition, how we manage it, deal with it, accept it or don't, is internal. And our brain does not discern between real and imagined on many, many levels. This is why you can watch a Hallmark movie and cry or go to a scary movie and scream, right? It's why Jaws music will evoke panic in a lot of people. So the brain doesn't discern. It's called cognitive fusion. Right now, we are bombarded with primarily negative messaging and constantly changing negative messaging, right? We've gone from 1 million people dead to 20,000. The ranges here are enormous and it's shifting so fast. And your brain takes all of this in and it doesn't discern between fact and opinion, speculation, emotional outburst, flash of brilliance, whatever it is, it does not discern. And then it begins a process of what's called rumination. Over and over and over again, we think the same thunk. Mm-hmm. When we do that, we're creating neural pathways in the brain that then get coded in myelin, and the thicker that pathway, the more likely we are to travel it again. So it's really, really important to think about these factors of resilience: positive, focused, proactive, flexible, and organized, and really increase our muscles. As you were talking about earlier, we have enormous neuroplasticity. We used to believe that once you learn something, you couldn't unlearn or relearn, right? An old dog can't learn new tricks kind of stuff. We know that's absolutely false. We've unlearned that about the brain in the last 10 years. So this neuroplasticity, simply defined, means we can create new pathways. Until we're diseased or we're dead, we can create new pathways. So it's really crucial, this exercising notion of the brain, this intentionally creating new pathways. And by the way, even faking it, forcing yourself to sit down and for 1 minute thinking positive thoughts, silver linings, what can I learn from this? How can I turn this into something better? What can I control? Even faking it, the brain doesn't know you are. Yeah. So we really can manipulate ourselves and others quite a bit. And I use that word manipulate intentionally because humans are one of the easiest creatures on the planet to manipulate. When we begin to understand what's going on and how we can shift it and be much more proactive, positive, flexible, focused, and organized. And that really is the depth underneath resiliency. They're not difficult concepts on the surface, but those darn humans.
Yeah.
It is challenging because of who we are now, we were.
So Holly, I love those factors because those factors are absolutely valuable right now in the world that we're living in. But if I think about top leaders who are out there and people who are truly inspiring action and influencing others, they have those traits too. So it's great that a silver lining is we're all building these muscles right now, and it's going to reflect in our leadership capabilities moving forward. So it's definitely something that we can leverage now and well into the future, which is excellent.
Unquestionably, yep.
So Megan, you're up next. So
okay, Amanda.
So I have another fairly long question for you, so hold tight here. So through your lens as a restructuring advisor to business leaders, what do you perceive as the similarities between how organizations and their supply chains bolster resilience and how we as individuals do the same?
There are really way more parallels and similarities than there are differences in that. Certainly, during a time of disruption in an organization's life, during a period of restructuring, for example, which is certainly where my background is, there are significant disruptions in operations. The consequence is that there is significant financial disruption, material impact on liquidity, short and long-term financial viability, quite frankly. But what may not always be intuitive to people is that while breaching a debt covenant and a secured financing agreement may be a stress trigger for a leader, understandably so. Interestingly, having spent more years than I actually enjoy counting, advising leaders in distressed situations, what actually was the most taxing aspect of navigating change or navigating the turnaround journey was how they manage their human assets, right? Their organizational family, so to speak, during the material disruption. And it's not really just the operations, and it's not just the finance, but how is this impacting them emotionally and psychologically? And whether you sit in the C-suite, whether you're mid-level management, whether you're early career stage, no one is exempt from the pressures, particularly in the widespread magnitude of what we're facing now. No one's exempt. We can't get rid of the pressures. We can't escape the stressors. We haven't elected into them. They've been thrust upon us. And so how resilient we are as business leaders and as individuals in our respective lives really is the predictor of whether we thrive and in some cases, whether we even can survive. And so if we think about it like this, supply chain resiliency, folks, is really the measure of the company's ability to withstand disruptive events. Is that any different with regard to resiliency in self? Resiliency in self is really a measure of the individual's capacity to do the same, an individual's ability to withstand disruptive events. And so while an organization may have systems in place that are flexible, rigorous, adaptive, and they may have practices and policies that allow them to pivot and thus would otherwise under anticipated disruption, right, nonetheless position them to make responsible business decisions and to be able to flex and pivot. In this type of disruption for which there is no precedent, there's no ability to foresee it. There's no ability to actually alternative plan in the way that we're used to having alternative planning and alternative contingencies. And so for the organization and for the individuals who are driving its success at this chapter, really the central focus is how do we increase our flexibility, how do we increase our agility, our responsiveness, and our overall performance. And there's not a magic formula, as we've all been talking about here. There's no such thing as a magic formula, but resilience is the attribute most relevant to actually navigating it with success. In terms of contingency planning and alternative planning that we as responsible business persons do all the time, there's only so much of that one can do when one can't even foresee, right, the crisis. And so that begs the question, okay, Megan, well then how do we bolster that resilience and in turn strengthen our performance, which is what my co-panelists here have been exploring. And I know the next chapter of your questions is going to more pointedly address. So I'll pause there, Amanda.
Okay, that sounds good. So, Tamara, I'm going to throw a curveball at you, and this is totally your choice. You said at the beginning that you were flexible. So we're getting a question from one of the attendees that's somewhat directed at you. Do you want to do your question or the question from the attendee?
I think I'll kind of wrap them both together.
Okay, perfect. So Dr. Sean asked, I'm wondering what other tips you have to manage and soothe employee and suppliers through this crisis, and what, let's see, what else? And how we can use, what we can use right now to lead them through this crisis. And then it is directed at you, wondering what else Tamara is doing as a leader right now for Corteva.
Right, and so my actual question was in regards to the space that my team, my global team that I manage, the space that we manage is actually quite tough right now, right? So if you think about it, I have some amazing category leads across the globe that really are handling travel, event situations, technology, and professional services. And so when you think about all of that and how do you really manage that in this time, it really isn't in this time, right? It's really, we are managing those spaces because we take a look at it from a risk perspective. And so when you step back and you look at how do we effectively manage our supply chain, we need to look at in those specific areas, whether it is, you know, the OMS space that my colleague Joe Stevens, who you know, reached out to GWPP, or in my space and my category leaders are working on, you know, you've got to take a look at it from a perspective of, do you have that visibility that's required and control over what is happening in your supply chain? And I don't mean control in the sense of I manage what's happening with my suppliers, more so control over understanding what is happening with your suppliers. So this goes back to Megan's point of supplier relationship, right? So each one of my category leads that have been working through these events really reaches out to their suppliers to understand what's happening in the market, right? So think about from a travel perspective, right? Travel's down. We don't know. The Chief Procurement Officer, Craig Reed for Corteva, often says, we wonder what the new normal is going to look like, right? Because there's going to be this new way of doing business moving forward. Will people travel as much as they used to? Look at this event, right? For example, right? We're now doing a lot of things through Zoom because one of the reasons why is because we have to, right? But in other sense, once we are through all of this and it is done, do we continue to do that? Do we continue to do this type of outreach from our home, right? And then also, you also, and I mentioned this the first question, right, is really connecting with your suppliers and going back over to understand and ensure that they're also building resiliency in their companies, right? Because if you don't have them doing the same, you're going to have a gap. There's going to be a gap there, right? And so what are we specifically doing today? We're really monitoring what's happening. We're doing our outreach, as we said. We're building we're, you know, looking at how we mitigate our risk to determine what it is we need to do for the future, right? It's a long term, right? We've got the short term issue happening, but there's a long term effect that we need to be looking at as well. And keep that in mind as we go through from a supply chain perspective.
Yeah. Thanks, Tamara, and thanks, Dr. Shane, for the question. So it's interesting because I mentioned GWPP moving forward is planning on doing more virtual events and even virtual conferences. And when we were looking at it, we're like, wait, we have a global organization and we were having local events. Not everyone could attend a local event, especially if you lived overseas. So this technology and this opportunity that we're having right now, if we can call it that, to learn, is opening our eyes to the possibilities of what we could do for women in procurement. So I think there will be some sort of new normal that comes out of this. So we have 5 minutes left. Talking about flexibility, we have a whole set of questions. We have 5 more questions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw a curveball out here. I think this is a fabulous conversation, and I think it's worth running over. So if anyone has to drop off at the top of the hour, just so you know, we will record the rest of it and publish it out so you can hear the rest of the story. But I think we should keep on going. What do you guys all think? Yeah? We're good to go?
I'm good with that.
Okay, all right. So, Catherine, let's talk a little bit about developing resiliency. Now we're doing some of this already just because it's being forced upon us right now. And some of us might be doing it better than others, depending on where we're at. But how can we develop resiliency?
Yeah, wonderful question. And I think it's something that I'm frankly clinging to day by day. So I'll say 3 things. One, it's really important for us all to focus on the positives. Being able to make a list every day of, okay, things I'm thankful for today, whether it's getting a good night's sleep, whether it's not having to worry about getting my hair and nails done or whatever. It's important to say what is good about this and focusing on those small joys. It's really important to develop goals and to have a purpose. So eventually this will end, and it would be wonderful if when this did, we had a accomplish something. For example, I used to be really, really bad at Zoom. I was super scared about it. I was intimidated by it. And you know what? I'm like Zoom every day, and I'm getting a whole lot better at understanding, how to use the technology. I remember to mute myself, not, and whatever. So I think 3, and this is something that I've actually been really heartened about. Panelists who I can see, your hand if you've been struck by the amount of altruism that we've seen over the last few weeks, right? People are overwhelmingly doing wonderful things, right? We're seeing people donating masks, donating food, standing outside and applauding hospital workers when they change shifts. By the people who dostered a shelter's time. And the reality is that this is a time in which we're actually developing empathy. A lot of us have talked about mortality, the importance of empathy. I've been wonderfully struck by the amount of outpouring. I think like stores setting up the first morning hours for older shoppers to make sure that the people who are most vulnerable to infection are able to shop at a less crowded time. And here's an opportunity that we can all focus on ways of developing empathy, ways of developing our ego, and resilience is very closely linked. A lot of them described to this empathy and this altruism. And I'm really heartened by that as a person, as an American.
Yeah, it's something I've been actually personally thinking a lot about lately is whenever we're going through a stressful situation, whatever it is, it's something else going on in our life. If you can focus on how you can serve and support others, it helps so much. It takes the focus off of what you're feeling necessarily, and you're actually going out and helping your fellow human beings in whatever way that you can do that. So I love that message, Catherine. So Holly, this in the same vein, what 2 tips do you believe can have the most impact the most quickly in building our resiliency?
Well, I'm going to say ditto to everything Catherine said. Spot on. Think about what you're thinking about. So become an observing participant of yourself and think about what you're thinking about. Fake it if you have to focus on exactly what Catherine was saying, the positive, the silver lining, if you will, the benefits. So that's going to be really crucial because the brain doesn't discern that you're faking it really well. So that's going to be very, very helpful. I think the other thing you want to do is, if you remember that our brain really likes what it already knows, and that is at the core of why we're feeling nervited, as my daughter calls it, nervous and excited together, right? A lot of things. Is to think about what is staying the same. What can bring you in moments where you really are feeling a need to hold on? What can bring you a sense of comfort? This typically goes to our values, our faith, our friends, our family, some of the core things in our life that this is not going to change. How we interact may change, but the fact that we still love and care and want to serve, as you mentioned, those things are not going to change. And so hold on to that to bring yourself a sense of comfort. This notion of taking care of yourself in every way. Self-talk is crucial. Again, going back to that not discerning between real and imagined, be kind to yourself. Be patient with yourself. Listen, I work in this space, 24/7, and there are moments when I have panicked. I've been sad. I've been a little anxious, etc. Just know that that is normal. And getting through it quickly is the key. And the way that we do that are all the things that all these great panelists have talked about. So think about what you're thinking about, find what can bring you a sense of comfort, and get really, really clear on success or excellence for today. Break it down into very small pieces. For the next hour, I'm going to get this done. Mm-hmm. I'm going to actually change my day pajamas at 3 p.m. into my night pajamas, whatever it is. Whatever it is. But when we get that clarity, that's very, very helpful to us. And that sense of then even small achievements, small progress is very, very powerful in our brain.
Yeah, I love that. I use that with my kids all the time. I call them microbursts. Mm-hmm. If you just start a little something, it can grow into something much bigger, but just look at it as little tiny microbursts. Yeah. Fantastic. It seems to help them. I probably could apply it in my own life, but a little bit better, but great advice. So Elena, what questions can be used to redirect your brain's attention towards resiliency?
I'm a big fan of questions, doing what Holly was just talking about, is how can you pay attention to what you're thinking and then take it to the next step to actually refocus where you're thinking. So the brain cannot be, as we talked about those 2 parts, the brain can't be in both fear and curiosity at the same time. So as we move along that spectrum from anxiousness to empowerment, We want to go into curiosity as a way to actually empower ourselves to come into a more empowered state. So I am going to share some questions for each kind of stages along that journey from anxious to empowered. And I think what I'll do is I'll write these up in a blog and then I can share the link with you. So if I'm going a little too fast to write down everything, I'll do that in the next couple of days. But when you're in that first early stage of anxiousness, you can ask yourself, what am I experiencing right now? And whenever we reflect on our experience, it actually provides kind of an observation. It disassociates us just a little bit, very usefully, from being consumed by the emotion to, wait, what am I experiencing right now? So when you're in the anxious state, start there. Then notice and ask yourself, what am I resisting about what's happening or could happen? And in this place of noticing, what am I resisting being true? What am I trying to hold off? We actually can start to go through kind of a version of the stages of grief. And so there's something that I learned through NLP Marin. I've adapted just very slightly, but essentially it's this process of OMG, WTH, sometimes WTF, but we are all professionals here. So what the heck is where we're going to go with it today. So OMG, WTH, and then okay. So when we say OMG, we allow ourselves to notice the shock or the denial of what's happening. Then we can say, what the heck? What the heck is going on? That's where we kind of are honoring a little bit of that anger that might come up and maybe even some of that sadness. And then when we've kind of felt that enough, we can go to okay. Not I'm okay with this, but okay, this is happening. So as we kind of move through that stage and we allow ourselves to go through that, we can then get to that acceptance, which is the okay. And now the system can calm down enough for us to become resourceful, for the energy and that activity to move from back here, where it's all fight, freeze, flight, back to that resourceful part of our brain. So now that we're in the resourceful part of the brain, what questions can we ask? We talked about the meaning that we make and how that completely shifts the experience we have of what we're experiencing. So now we can say, what have I chosen to believe this means for me or about me? And beliefs are just solidified meanings. So the more meanings we make, the more often we do, then it becomes a belief. So almost one and the same. So what have I chosen to believe this means for or about me? This is the big one. What would someone have to believe to have a 10% better experience than me? What would I have to believe to have to improve my experience by 10%? And that 10% is something I normally don't include in my content, but right now under times of stress, we got to make it really doable. If it doesn't feel doable, it doesn't get done. So just looking and reaching for a 10% improvement right now is so much less stressful than, oh my gosh, how do I completely change everything? So it's that sense of control. Hey, I can do 10%. Then we also want to lean into that realistic optimism. So being resourceful about how can we be a little more optimistic, not so much that it's bouncing off, but we're kind of looking for that 10% shift there too. So the questions you can ask, what good can come from this and what good is possible in the future? And now we're in that last stage of being in an empowered place. And so this is where I'm leaning on what I call possibility thinking. It's in the book, and I also have it as a core part of the Inspiring Accountability Results Model, which is what I use with leaders to help them inspire accountability. It's on my website, inspiringaccountability.com, if you want to see the whole model. But possibility thinking is around these two questions. What's in the way? And given what's in the way, what's possible? Because so many times we just get stuck at what's in the way, what's not working, what's creating this anxiousness. And we forget to say, well, given what's in the way, which is our way of accepting it, right? Given that these things are happening that I can't control, what can I do? What is possible? So just some variations of that you can ask yourselves. And of course, you can ask this to your team. You know, we talked a little bit about the question of how do you soothe your team? Well, now we're in that realm where these questions are a little more, I would consider appropriate to ask in the workplace, where some of the other ones might have been a little more personal, just depends on the culture. So here's just in kind of closing, here are some ways you can use this very simple model. Given what's in the way, so given that this is happening, you can then follow that with what can I do? What would I like to focus on? What can I do to improve my experience by 10% right now? What is the first or easiest choice I can make to support my well-being right now or today? So again, I'll put those questions in a blog and I'll send them off if they'll be on the recording, of course. But when we ask a question, we're actually requiring an open-ended question, I should say. Open-ended questions require our brain to engage, process, and respond. And we literally are changing our thinking, we're changing where our focus is, and of course, our energy flows to what we're focusing on. So this is where, from that empowered place, we can really start to influence our experience of our experience.
Thank you so much. I cannot wait for the blog.
I know. And Elena, I have to say, you can actually take some of those questions and convert it into when you think about when you're negotiating with your suppliers as well,
yes.
Right? What is it that you're trying to get? Right? What is it? So taking those same questions that you are going to put in your blog for all of us and really using them at the same time when you're thinking about, because when you go in for a negotiation with a supplier, there's this whole strategy that you're putting together, right? And when you do that, you're thinking more maybe with the wrong side of the brain, right? But if you take a look at these open-ended questions and you ask yourself those questions and you think about what your outcome is that you want to get, you're going to have a much better roadmap to get there.
Yeah, I love that application.
Yeah.
And it's those questions, they can only be answered by this part of the brain. So it's to get us out of here. And that's exactly whether you're talking with another person, you're talking with a supplier, you're talking with an employee who's stressed, you're talking with a family member. When you start asking that, given that you're upset about this, and then you move toward that what's possible frame, you're getting ahead of it for sure.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, Tamara. So you were just talking about, applying all this to negotiation, but it's interesting from your seat in this ever-changing event that we're living in right now. What factors do you even start focusing on?
Yeah, so, and to your point, it is ever-changing, right? So when you're looking at the supply base and trying to understand the factors, let's go back to what Megan said, right, is that we are part of a company and we have a fiduciary right to represent that company and ensure we're getting the best for the company, even in these rough times, right? And so you need to look at what are your opportunities, right? You have to be opportunistic, right, at this particular point in time. So, considering all that is going on, right, you want to take a look at in certain commodity areas, does it make sense to do some really unique RFPing to determine that whether or not you've gotten the right pricing, right? Do you look at your operating model and focus on, is it buyer mode? Is it category management mode? Is it really moving the needle to where you need to be in this new norm, right? And so the factors will be all different for all different people from a people perspective, but from a company perspective, you really have to look at where do we continue to need to spend money? Where can we cut back from spending money? Where can we take a look at and optimize how we're doing things from a process standpoint, right? So really taking a look at that to ensure that we are going to be resilient as a company and move forward. So taking it a little different view from all the panelists today talking about self and looking really at it from a company perspective. And what do we do as the ambassadors of our company when we're talking to these suppliers? And we understand that they're going through rough times, but also understanding, that we need to do things in order to be resilient and to survive, right? And so, I'll open that question up to the panelists who, are obviously the experts, right? What factors would you all consider when you're thinking about from, sitting in the procurement seat, as many of the individuals who are on this LinkedIn site who are watching this, what advice would you give us from the perspective of, okay, I understand that there's empathy and what we need to do for the self. It's a different view when you look at it from the corporate, corporate view. Not saying we don't have empathy, but it's a view that says we want to survive. We want to be here tomorrow. So Megan, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I know, Amanda, this is your job,
well,
right?
This is great because it actually leads into Megan's next question. So I was like, ooh, this is good. She's setting me up for Megan's question.
Perfect, and I didn't even know that, right? But Megan, I mean, coming, in what you talked about a little bit about the supply chain, what's your view? I kind of gave mine.
Yes, well, I'm happy to share my view. And Tamara, I appreciate that you talked for a while about risk management, right? You have to wear a risk management hat through this entire journey. And Elena, I actually was scribbling, Elena Noel, while you were speaking, down some notes. I particularly wrote this one down. The brain can't be in both fear and curiosity simultaneously. Fascinating to me. So a couple of thoughts. In terms of, we talk about risk a lot. As business leaders, as managers and organizations, we talk about risk. And even in just our normal human being lives, right? We use the word risk a lot. I would encourage people to not, though, use the words risk and uncertainty interchangeably, because risk and uncertainty aren't synonyms. Risk is the measurable probability of an unwanted or unpalatable occurrence or outcome. Uncertainty is, gosh, I don't know what in the heck's going to happen and when. Right? And so there's a fundamental distinction between those two things. And so how does one then put herself in the position of cultivating this mindset of curiosity in this world of uncertainty, where some people feel incredibly destabilized, whether it's uncertainty with regard to relationship management with suppliers, processes, or even with regard to yourself. And what role does fear play in that? And so I am of the view that fear goes down as confidence in self and trust in self goes up. And so how do you bolster your confidence and how do you bolster your trust in yourself? We talk often as business professionals about how we strengthen our collaborative relationships with key stakeholders in our organization and in our supply chain. And we talk about the import of robust, trustworthy relationships to shore up that collaboration. What I think a lot of people don't spend time on is the trust relationship that they have with themselves. And if you shore up your trust relationship with yourself, which I'm of the view that that is frankly the most important relationship that you have in your life for the reasons we've already talked about, you are definitely going to be in a better position to navigate uncertainty because your fear is going to come down. Why? Because you trust that you can navigate your challenge to a successful conclusion. Amanda, you said earlier as an aside, geez, can we call it an opportunity? Not only can we call it an opportunity, I would invite everyone to focus on it as an opportunity. Focusing on it as an opportunity is not to naively ignore the challenges that are before us, right? But it is also making the election to focus on the positive perspective through which we can view it. And so what do we do? What do we do to say, wow, I've never faced a situation like this before. Wow, we have never as an organization been in this situation before. And oh, by the way, everyone else is in it with us and no one else has precedent for this. Well, I feel less afraid of the unknown if I trust that I'll make good decisions. So how do you really build a trust relationship with yourself? I think it falls into three categories. Do you trust that you're reliable? Do you do what you say you're going to do and how you say you're going to do it? Can you count on you? Two, do you trust your own business judgment? Do you trust that you have the skill set and have amassed the problem-solving skills, the analytic skills, et cetera, that actually bolster your confidence in your own decision-making ability? And three, do you trust your own intentionality? Right? We think about building trust relationships with others. We think about, wow, do you trust the person who you find their motives suspect? Absolutely not. If you trust that their motives are pure, that their motives are motives of integrity, that will shore up the relationship you have with them. The same is true of you. So if you trust that you're going to talk to yourself with empathy, you talk to yourself with words of encouragement, and you give yourself opportunities that are unfamiliar to you to stretch and expand that skill set to shore up your confidence, it is, of course, going to then not only allow you to better navigate the unfamiliar, but it's going to allow you to actually coach your collaborators to do the same. Let me give you one brief example of how you actually do that, if I may, Amanda.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. So I'll share a personal story with all of you. I call this the lawnmower story. And so I decided to restructure my entire life, walk away from the practice of law, start my own business, leave the entirety of my then personal circumstances behind me as well, or I should say, more aptly, restructured my personal life while I was restructuring my professional life, which was one of restructuring to that juncture. And in the process, I basically decided that I was going to walk away from my career, which meant that I was walking away from an income, and I was living and swimming in this ocean of uncertainty. And I said to myself, how am I going to trust that I can face the unfamiliar? And my lawnmower broke. Now, I don't know what a lawnmower is all about. I have no aspirations to be a lawnmower repair expert. But I did wish to prove to myself that no matter what challenge, big or small, was put before me, that I was going to be able to figure it out and navigate it to a successful conclusion. And so I got out a do-it-yourself video, and I'm not kidding you, I watched it 11 times. And I replaced the spark plugs, and that didn't cure the problem. And then I replaced the air filter, and that didn't solve the problem. And ultimately, then I went to the carburetor and rebuilt the carburetor in the lawnmower. Now, just to contextualize this for all of you, I have absolutely no idea what a carburetor is, let alone what a carburetor does, or the fact that a lawnmower has a carburetor. But that didn't stop me. Now, just to add color to this, I'm not a particularly patient direction reading person. So to have watched the do-it-yourself video 11 times, it proved to give me a return on my investment because I repaired the lawnmower. And I didn't have to spend $300 to go buy another one. Now, here's the takeaway, folks. Who cares about the lawnmower, right? Ultimately, the consequence of my having done this is I said to myself, give me any challenge, and I'm going to face it as an opportunity. Give me any problem, and I know that I'm resourceful enough, I'm reliable enough, and I exercise careful and responsible diligence and business decision-making that I will navigate my way to a successful conclusion. And so I invite everyone to do as Eleanor Roosevelt has invited us to do, and that is do one thing every darn day that scares you, because it will reduce your fear and it will bolster your self-confidence. and your trust relationship with yourself. And may I close, Amanda,
Yes.
by expressing my appreciation to Joe Stevens for today's opportunity, of course, to Tamara Pulaski for this opportunity, to Michelle Morin for the same, and to GWPP, Amanda and Sarah and others. Thank you for the pleasure of sharing today's conversation.
Yeah, and thank you all so much. This was absolutely fantastic. We're getting chat messages coming through that there is a great session, love this. There was some conversation about faking it in networking opportunities until you feel comfortable. So believe me, I know this was valuable for me to hear. It was valuable, hopefully, for everyone else to hear. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for your passion, your perspective that you shared today, and your leadership. It goes a long way, and I know everyone benefited from it today. I also would love to thank Michelle Morin, the entire Corteva leadership team, for their leadership and their support of GWPP. And I wish each and every one of you who held on an extra 21 minutes today, a very big thank you. And I wish you all the best for challenging yourself to face your fears and use some of the information you learned today to have greater resilience. So to each of you, have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you all.